The air smelled like roses and regret. As I stood beside my mother's casket, clutching her worn leather-bound Bible in one hand and the heirloom gold watch in the other, my father's voice thundered through the quiet chapel, turning every grieving head in the room toward me. You? A dead weight like you doesn't deserve anything she left behind, especially not that watch. His words sliced through the reverent silence of Ashwood Community Church, the same place where I'd been baptized as a child, where I'd watched my mother sing in the choir every Sunday until her illness made it impossible. Now her voice was forever silenced, and my father's cruel outburst echoed off the vaulted ceiling, amplifying my humiliation. I felt every eye judging me, Mrs. Peterson from the library, where Mom and I volunteered, Pastor Richards, who'd visited Mom daily during her final weeks, even Jason, my brother, who stood beside Dad with that familiar look of practiced neutrality. My knees weakened. I wanted to drop through the polished floorboards to disappear completely. Dad, please, I whispered, my voice barely audible. Not here. But Douglas Monroe was beyond reasoning. Grief had twisted his features into something unfamiliar and frightening. Or perhaps it wasn't grief at all. Perhaps it was simply his true nature, unmasked at last. Give it to me, he demanded, extending his hand. Now, Rachel. With a swift, violent motion, he snatched the gold watch from my trembling fingers. The delicate chain caught briefly on my skin, leaving a thin red mark. I clutched my mother's Bible tighter, expecting him to take that too. People stared, but said nothing. Not even Jason, who had flown in from Seattle in his expensive suit, looking more like a stranger than my brother. He shifted uncomfortably, but remained silent, just as he always did when Dad's anger found its target in me. I stood frozen in humiliation and heartbreak, unable to move or speak. Mom's casket was right there, adorned with white lilies, her favorite. Would she have wanted this? This public shaming of her daughter at her own funeral? Margaret would have wanted Jason to have it, Dad continued, his voice slightly lower but no less venomous. He's made something of himself. What have you done? Quit your job to come back to this small town, hovering around your mother like some kind of Douglas. Pastor Richards finally stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on my father's shoulder. This is a time for remembering Margaret, for honoring her memory. Dad shrugged off the pastor's hand but fell silent. He tucked Mom's gold watch, the one she'd received from her own mother, and her mother before that, into his suit pocket. Then he turned and walked back to the front pew, where Jason stood awkwardly waiting. I remained where I was, clutching the Bible like a lifeline, tears streaming silently down my face. Aunt Meredith, Mom's sister, finally came to my side and guided me back to my seat. Her arm around my shoulders felt like the only thing keeping me upright. I'm so sorry, sweetheart, she whispered. Your mother would be heartbroken to see this. The rest of the service passed in a blur. I heard Pastor Richards speak of Mom's kindness, her unwavering faith, her service to the community. I heard distant sobs from various corners of the church. I felt the weight of the Bible in my lap, the only piece of Mom I'd been allowed to keep. When it was time, I watched as 6 men, including Jason but not me, carried Mom's casket out to the waiting hearse. Dad walked directly behind it, his back straight, his head high as if he were the only one truly grieving. As if my year of caregiving, of sleeping on the couch in their living room, of administering medications and changing bedsheets and cooking meals that Mom could barely eat, as if none of that counted as love. At the graveside, I stood apart from them. Not by choice, but because the space beside Dad and Jason had been filled by distant relatives and Mom's childhood friends. I was pushed to the periphery of my own mother's final goodbye. Just as I'd been pushed to the periphery of her life with Dad, even as I was the one holding her hand when she took her last breath. After the final prayer, as people began to disperse, several approached me with quiet condolences. Mrs. Peterson hugged me tightly. Your mother was so proud of you, she whispered. She told me so many times. I nodded, unable to speak. If Mom had been proud, she'd never said it where Dad could hear. Their 40-year marriage had taught her which battles to fight and which to surrender. And somewhere along the way, defending me had fallen into the latter category. I drove back to my small apartment above Bloom and Petal, the florist shop where I'd found part-time work after returning to Ashwood. It wasn't much a studio with slanted ceilings and windows that rattled when the wind blew, but it was mine. A space where Dad couldn't reach me, couldn't diminish me with his disappointment. As I changed out of my black dress, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. I looked hollow, like someone had scooped out everything inside me and left just the shell. At 32, I'd expected to be somewhere else by now. Married, perhaps, with a house and a career and a life that belonged fully to me. Instead, I'd spent the past year watching my mother die slowly while my father blamed me for things I couldn't control. I curled up on my bed, still clutching Mom's Bible. Inside the front cover, she'd written a simple message years ago. To my Rachel, may you always find light in the darkness. Love, Mom. Light in the darkness. It seemed impossible now. Mom had been my light, my advocate, my soft place to land. Without her, what was left? I fell into a fitful sleep, dreaming of gold watches and funeral flowers and my father's voice, thundering through an empty church. I never expected what morning would bring. The knocking startled me awake at 7:13 a.m. I remember the time precisely because I glared at my bedside clock, wondering who would disturb me the morning after my mother's funeral. I'd planned to stay in bed all day, curtains drawn, phone off. Grief is exhausting, and humiliation even more so. But the knocking continued, insistent and desperate. Rachel? Rachel, are you in there? My father's voice. I froze, wondering if I could pretend to be out. But where would I go at 7 a.m, the day after burying my mother? Please, Rachel. I need to talk to you. Something in his tone, a tremor I'd never heard before, made me slide out of bed. I pulled on a robe over my pajamas and padded to the door, pausing with my hand on the knob. What do you want? I called through the wood. Please, just open the door. His voice cracked. I'm not alone. Not alone? Had he brought Jason to continue yesterday's humiliation? Or maybe Pastor Richards as some kind of mediator? Curiosity won out over caution. I opened the door. Dad stood there, still wearing yesterday's suit pants, though he'd exchanged the jacket for a rumpled cardigan. His silver hair was uncombed, his eyes red-rimmed and puffy. In his trembling hand, he held Mom's gold watch. Behind him stood an elderly man I didn't recognize. Tall and straight-backed despite his obvious age, wearing a military-style jacket with patches I couldn't identify. His white hair was cropped close to his head, and his weathered face held an expression of grave seriousness. Rachel, Dad said, his voice barely above a whisper. This is Captain Eli Green. He was a friend of your mother's. I blinked, looking between them. Mom never mentioned a Captain Green. The older man stepped forward, extending a hand. She wouldn't have, ma'am. Our friendship was complicated. I shook his hand automatically, noting the firmness of his grip despite the age spots and visible veins. I don't understand. What are you doing here? Dad looked down at the watch in his hand, then back at me. His eyes filled with tears. Something I'd seen only twice before, when Jason graduated from college and when Mom was first diagnosed. Can we come in? He asked, and the pleading in his voice was so unfamiliar that I stepped aside without thinking. My apartment was tiny, just a main room with a kitchenette in one corner and a bed in another, plus a small bathroom. I gestured to my only seating options, a secondhand love seat and a folding chair I'd set up as a makeshift dining area. Dad took the chair, leaving the love seat for Captain Green and me. The old soldier sat with military precision, back straight, feet flat on the floor. I perched on the edge of the cushion, suddenly aware of my unbrushed hair and sleep-creased face. Captain Green came to the house this morning, Dad began, staring at the watch rather than at me. He had information about your mother. What kind of information? I asked, my pulse quickening. Had Mom been hiding something? A illness worse than we thought? A secret I should know? Captain Green reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope slightly yellowed with age. Mrs. Monroe, your mother and I served together in a MASH unit in Vietnam, 1971 to 1972. I was a patient. She was a nurse. I blinked in surprise. Mom never talked about Vietnam. No, he agreed solemnly. She wouldn't have. When she returned, she wanted to leave that chapter behind. But we kept in touch. For over 40 years, we exchanged letters. Letters? I echoed, trying to imagine my mother, the woman who baked cookies for the church bake sale and read mystery novels and tended roses in the backyard, having a secret pen pal for decades. I never saw any letters. She had them sent to a P.O. box in Bedford, Captain Green explained. She'd collect them once a month when she went to visit her friend Ruth. He paused. That was her cover story, at least. Ruth passed away 15 years ago. I glanced at Dad, whose face had crumpled in on itself like tissue paper in water. He nodded miserably. It's true. I found a box of them in the attic yesterday after everyone left. Your mother confided in me, Captain Green continued. About her life, her children, her marriage. His eyes flicked briefly toward my father, then back to me. 3 weeks before she passed, she sent me this. He handed me the envelope. It was addressed to him in Mom's familiar handwriting, the blue ink slightly faded. The postmark showed it had been mailed just days before she'd become too weak to leave her bed. Read it, Captain Green urged gently. She wanted you to have it, but only if necessary. With trembling fingers, I opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded around a legal document. I unfolded the letter first. My dearest Eli, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and things have unfolded exactly as I feared. Douglas has always resented Rachel's sensitivity, her kindness, the very qualities I love most about her. I worry that without me to intervene, he will hurt her in ways that cannot be repaired. The enclosed document is an amendment to my will, properly notarized and filed with my attorney. I've left my personal belongings, including my mother's watch, to Rachel. Douglas knows this, but I fear he may ignore my wishes. If he does, please find Rachel. Show her this letter. Give her the strength I couldn't always provide while living under Douglas's roof. Rachel deserves to know she was never a disappointment to me. Her return to Ashwood was not the failure Douglas painted it to be, but an act of love I can never repay. She gave me peace in my final year that no one else could have provided. Tell her I'm sorry I couldn't stand up to him more while I was alive. Some battles can only be fought from beyond. With eternal gratitude for your friendship, Margaret, I looked up, tears blurring my vision. Dad was openly weeping now, the watch clutched in his fist. She filed this with her attorney, Captain Green said, pointing to the legal document. It's binding. The watch and everything else she specified belongs to you, Rachel. I stared at the paper, then at my father. You knew, I whispered. You knew what she wanted, and still you— I was wrong, Dad interrupted, his voice broken. I was so wrong. About everything. He extended his hand, the watch glinting in his palm. This is yours. It always was. I accepted the watch from my father's trembling hand, feeling its familiar weight, a connection to Mom, to her mother, to generations of women before me. The gold was warm, as if it had absorbed some of Dad's body heat or perhaps carried a trace of Mom's spirit. I closed my fingers around it, but I couldn't find words. Captain Green cleared his throat. There's more, Ms. Monroe. My eyes moved from the watch to his weathered face. In the morning light streaming through my apartment windows, I could see the map of his life etched into his skin laugh lines, worry lines, history written in every crease. More, I echoed. He nodded, reaching again into his jacket. Your mother kept every letter I sent her over the years, and copies of most of hers to me. He withdrew a small folded photograph. She also kept this. The photo showed a much younger version of my mother, perhaps 22 or 23, standing beside a hospital bed. In the bed lay a young soldier, his leg bandaged, his face gaunt but smiling. Captain Green, 45 years younger. She saved my life, he said softly. Not just medically, though she did that too. I was ready to give up after my injury. Your mother talked me back from that edge. I studied the photo, recognizing Mom's smile. The same one she'd given me countless times. Encouraging, steadfast, believing in someone when they couldn't believe in themselves. She never told me about Vietnam, I said. Not once. Dad's voice broke the silence. She tried to tell me early in our marriage. I told her I didn't want to hear about it. His eyes were fixed on the floor. I said the war was over, and we should leave it in the past. The air in my tiny apartment felt charged with decades of unspoken truths. I looked back at Captain Green. So you and my mother were friends all these years, and none of us knew? Friends, he confirmed with a slight nod. Nothing more, nothing less. She loved your father, Rachel. But she needed someone who understood that part of her life. Someone who saw her as she was before me, Dad interrupted, his voice hollow. Before I tried to make her into what I thought a postal worker's wife should be. Captain Green's eyes softened. She chose you, Douglas. Never doubt that. But everyone needs someone who witnesses their full truth. I turned the watch over in my palm. On the back was an inscription I'd never noticed before. To Margaret, time reveals all truth's mother. I ran my thumb over the engraved words. Why are you here now? I asked Captain Green. Why did you come to my father first instead of me? The captain exchanged a look with Dad. Your mother asked me to, in her final letter. She believed Douglas needed to face what he'd done before you could truly heal. She was wise that way, your mother. Dad stood suddenly, pacing the small space between my kitchenette and the door. I didn't believe him at first, he said. When he showed up this morning with all those letters, I thought it was some kind of scam. He paused, running a hand through his disheveled hair. But then he knew private things about Margaret, about us. He turned to face me. About how I treated you. I clutched the watch tighter, feeling the metal press into my palm. You treated me like I was worthless, I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. Like coming home to care for Mom was something shameful instead of the most loving thing a daughter could do, Captain Green finished for me. Your mother wrote to me almost weekly during your time back in Ashwood. She was so grateful, Rachel. So proud of your sacrifice. It wasn't a sacrifice, I whispered. She was my mother. Dad sank back onto the folding chair, which creaked under his weight. I was jealous, he admitted, the words seeming to physically pain him. Of the connection you two had. Of how easily you could talk to her, how you knew what she needed without asking. He shook his head. I tried to make you feel small because I felt small beside you. The admission hung in the air between us. This vulnerable version of my father was more disorienting than his anger had ever been. For decades, Douglas Monroe had been a wall of disapproval, immovable and impenetrable. Now the wall was crumbling before my eyes, revealing someone broken and afraid. I don't know what to say to that, I told him honestly. Captain Green rose to his feet, surprisingly spry for his age. You don't have to say anything right now, Ms. Monroe. Healing takes time. He glanced at his watch, a simple, practical timepiece, nothing like Mom's ornate heirloom. I should be going. I have a long drive back to Pittsburgh. Wait, I said, standing too. Will you stay in touch? I'd like to hear more about Mom, about the part of her life I never knew. His face softened. I'd like that very much. Your mother asked me to look out for you, if you'd allow it. He reached into his pocket once more and produced a business card. My number. Call anytime. I accepted the card, noting the simple text. Captain Elijah Green, Retweet, Veterans Outreach Coordinator. A piece of my mother's hidden history, now extended to me. Captain Green turned to my father. Douglas, remember what we discussed? Dad nodded, not meeting his eyes. I will. After brief goodbyes, Captain Green left. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone with my father, something I'd actively avoided for months before Mom's death. The silence stretched between us, heavy with unspoken pain. Finally, Dad cleared his throat. Rachel, He stopped, seeming to struggle for words. I don't expect your forgiveness. What I did yesterday at the funeral, it was unforgivable. I sat back down on the love seat, suddenly exhausted despite having just woken up. Why did you do it? Why there, in front of everyone? He passed a hand over his face. I don't know if I can explain it in a way that makes any sense. When I saw you with that watch, something that had been in Margaret's family for generations, all I could think was that she was really gone. That you would carry on her legacy and I would be forgotten. His voice cracked. It was selfish and cruel. I see that now. I twisted the watch chain around my fingers, remembering how it had felt when he yanked it away, how the church had fallen silent, how even Jason had looked away in shame. Do you know what hurts the most? I asked quietly. Not the public humiliation, though that was bad. It's that you really believe I'm a failure. That coming back to care for Mom was somehow giving up on my life. Dad's shoulders slumped. I was wrong, he said simply. Captain Green showed me your mother's letters, what she wrote about you. How you read to her when her eyes got too tired. How you learned to cook her favorite meals when nothing else tasted good to her. How you made her laugh even in her final weeks. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. You gave her a good death, Rachel. That's more important than any career or achievement. The words I'd longed to hear for so long now felt hollow, coming only after Captain Green's intervention. Would Dad ever have reached this understanding on his own? What happens now? I asked. Dad reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded paper. This is a copy of the amendment to your mother's will. The original is with her attorney. He placed it on my coffee table. Everything she wanted you to have is listed there. I'll make sure you get it all. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. And he hesitated. I'd like to try to make amends if you'll let me. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday. I looked at my father, really looked at him, and saw not just the man who had humiliated me at my mother's funeral, but the one who had once pushed me on the swings at Riverfront Park, who had taught me to ride a bike, who had loved my mother in his flawed, possessive way. Someday, I agreed, but not today. He nodded, accepting this partial peace offering. As he rose to leave, he paused at the door. Your mother loved you more than anything in this world, Rachel. More than me. More than Jason. I think I always knew that, and it made me... He stopped. Well, it made me less than I should have been. After he left, I sat in the quiet of my apartment, the watch in one hand and the photograph of my mother and Captain Green in the other pieces of a woman I thought I knew completely, but who had contained depths I was only beginning to discover. Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, a mockery of the storm inside me. 3 days had passed since the funeral, since my father's public explosion and subsequent private apology. 3 days of fielding concerned calls from distant relatives and avoiding the curious stares of neighbors when I ventured out for groceries. Small towns have long memories, and in Ashwood, mine would forever include the image of Douglas Monroe snatching his dead wife's heirloom from his daughter's wrist. I hadn't planned to attend church that morning. The thought of walking back into Ashwood Community Church, of sitting in the same pew where I'd watched my mother's casket just days before, made my stomach clench. But as I sipped my coffee by the window, watching parishioners in their Sunday best making their way down Main Street, a certainty settled over me. I needed to reclaim that space. For Mom, for myself. I dressed carefully in a simple blue dress, Mom's favorite color on me, and fastened her gold watch around my wrist. The weight of it felt right, like an anchor connecting me to something solid in the shifting landscape of grief. When I arrived at the church, the first person I saw was Mrs. Peterson, standing by the entrance with her usual stack of bulletins. "Rachel," she exclaimed, pulling me into a tight hug. "I wasn't sure we'd see you today, dear." She lowered her voice. "After what happened, I almost didn't come," I admitted. "But this was Mom's church. I don't want to lose that connection to her." Mrs. Peterson squeezed my hand. "Your mother would be proud. She always said you had quiet strength." Her eyes dropped to the watch on my wrist, and she smiled. "I'm glad to see that where it belongs." Inside, the church was filling quickly. I slipped into a pew near the back, hoping to remain inconspicuous. But in a congregation that had known me since childhood, anonymity was impossible. Several people stopped to offer condolences or squeeze my shoulder in silent support. Then, just as the organist began the prelude, a murmur rippled through the church. I turned to see my father walking down the center aisle. He wore a dark suit, his silver hair neatly combed, a stark contrast to the disheveled man who had appeared at my door 3 days ago. His eyes scanned the pews until they found me. For a moment he hesitated, then walked deliberately in my direction. "May I?" he asked quietly, gesturing to the empty space beside me. A week ago, I would have moved to make room automatically, trained by decades of accommodation. Today I paused, weighing the request against my own needs. "Just to sit," he added, seeming to understand my hesitation. "Nothing more." I nodded, sliding over slightly. Dad settled beside me, careful to maintain a respectful distance. We sat in silence as the service began, the familiar rhythms of hymns and prayers washing over us. Pastor Richard stepped to the pulpit, his kind eyes sweeping over the congregation. "Today," he began, "I want to talk about truth, about how it cannot remain buried forever." He paused. "And about the courage it takes to face it when it emerges." I felt Dad stiffen beside me. The sermon wasn't subtle in its inspiration. As Pastor Richard spoke about biblical examples of hidden truths brought to light, I found myself wondering how much he knew. Had Captain Green spoken to him? Or was this simply divine timing? When the service ended, I expected Dad to leave quietly. Instead, he turned to me. "Rachel, there's something I need to do. It won't be comfortable for either of us, but it's necessary." Before I could ask what he meant, he stood and made his way to the front of the church, where Pastor Richards was chatting with the choir director. They spoke briefly, and the pastor nodded, looking surprised but supportive. Pastor Richards stepped to the microphone. "Before you all leave, Douglas Monroe has asked to say a few words." A curious hush fell over the congregation. Dad cleared his throat, his fingers gripping the edges of the pulpit. Most of you were at Margaret's funeral on Thursday, he began, his voice stronger than I expected. And most of you witnessed something shameful. Not on Rachel's part. His eyes found mine across the rows of pews, but on mine. I felt heat rise to my face as dozens of heads turned in my direction. This was not what I had expected or wanted. I publicly humiliated my daughter at her mother's funeral, Dad continued. I took something that rightfully belonged to her, something Margaret explicitly wanted her to have, and I did it out of selfishness and pride. The church was utterly silent now, every ear straining to catch his words. I sat frozen, torn between wanting to flee and needing to hear what came next. Yesterday, I learned that my wife, who I thought I knew completely after 40 years of marriage, had parts of her life I never bothered to understand. That she maintained a friendship for decades with someone who saw her fully in ways I refused to. He paused, collecting himself. And I learned that while I was busy resenting Rachel for coming home to care for her mother, Margaret was writing letters about how grateful she was. How proud she was of our daughter's sacrifice. Dad's voice broke and he gripped the pulpit tighter. I was wrong. Wrong about Rachel. Wrong about what Margaret wanted. Wrong about what matters in this life. He looked directly at me again. Rachel gave her mother peace in her final months. She gave up her job, her apartment, her independence not because she failed, as I cruelly suggested, but because she possesses a kind of love I'm only beginning to understand. Tears welled in my eyes, blurring the image of my father standing where just days ago men had eulogized my mother. I can't undo what I did, Dad continued, but I can acknowledge it publicly, just as I humiliated Rachel publicly. And I can ask not for forgiveness, which I haven't earned, but for your help in respecting Margaret's wishes going forward. He stepped back from the microphone, nodding to Pastor Richards, who looked both stunned and moved. Dad made his way back through the pews, but not to where I sat. He headed straight for the exit, shoulders straight but head slightly bowed. The church erupted in whispers as soon as the door closed behind him. Several people immediately surrounded me, offering support or simply staring in fascination. Mrs. Peterson pushed through them, taking the seat Dad had vacated. "Are you all right, dear?" she asked, patting my hand. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure. My father's public apology, unexpected and unasked for, had left me feeling exposed again, albeit in a different way than the funeral had. "Did you know he was going to do that?" Pastor Richards asked, kneeling beside the pew. "No," I said. "I had no idea." "It took courage," the pastor said gently, "for him to admit his failings so publicly." I nodded again, unable to find words for the complicated mix of emotions swirling inside me. Relief that the truth was known. Residual anger at being made a spectacle again, even in apology. And beneath it all, a tentative, fragile hope that perhaps something was shifting in Dad, in me, in the space between us. As the congregation dispersed, Jason appeared at the end of the pew. My brother looked uncomfortable in his crisp button-down shirt, hands shoved deep in his pockets. "Rachel," he said, voice low. "Can we talk?" Jason. His name felt foreign on my tongue. During Mom's illness, my brother had been a voice on the phone, a signature on flowers delivered to the hospital, a vague promise to visit soon that rarely materialized. Now he stood before me, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. His expensive watch not a family heirloom, but a status symbol he'd bought himself glinting under the church lights. "Maybe we could get coffee," he suggested, glancing around at the lingering parishioners who were clearly interested in our conversation. "There's a lot we should discuss." Part of me wanted to refuse. To tell him that he'd had a year of Mom's illness to discuss things, had the funeral to say something, anything when Dad had humiliated me. But curiosity won out. What could Jason possibly have to say now? "Fine," I agreed. Carson's Cafe is just down the block. We walked in silence, the spring sun warm on our backs. Carson's was busy with the after-church crowd, but we found a small table by the window. Jason ordered a black coffee. I chose chamomile tea, remembering how Mom used to make it for me when I was upset. "So," I said after our drinks arrived, "what did you want to talk about?" Jason stared into his coffee. "I owe you an apology," he said finally, "for a lot of things." I wrapped my hands around my warm mug, waiting. "I should have been here more during Mom's illness," he continued. "I should have helped with her care, with Dad, with everything." "Yes," I agreed simply. "You should have." He looked up, surprise flickering across his face. Perhaps he'd expected immediate forgiveness, the way I'd always given it before. The peacemaker. The accommodator. The one who absorbed others' failings to keep the family functioning. That's fair, he acknowledged. I wasn't there. I left it all to you because it was easier to send money from Seattle than to actually show up. It wasn't about money, Jason. I took a sip of tea, collecting my thoughts. Mom didn't need financial support. She needed her son to sit with her, to talk to her, to just be present. He nodded, eyes dropping back to his coffee. I know. I told myself I was too busy with work, that I couldn't get away. But the truth is, I couldn't handle seeing her so sick. His voice lowered. I couldn't face the fact that she was dying. I thought of the countless nights I'd spent in the hospital, and then at home. Watching monitors, adjusting pillows, reading aloud when Mom's eyes grew too tired to focus on the page. The fear I'd pushed down to be strong for her. The exhaustion I'd ignored because there was no one else to take my place. I faced it, I said quietly. Every day, alone. Jason winced. I know. And at the funeral, when Dad... He trailed off, clearly uncomfortable. I should have said something. Stopped him. But I froze. You always freeze when it comes to Dad, I observed, surprising myself with the bluntness of my words. Ever since we were kids. He'd be yelling at me for something, and you'd just disappear into your room. It was self-preservation, Jason admitted. If I stayed quiet, stayed perfect, his anger would focus on you instead of me. He met my eyes for the first time. I'm not proud of it, Rachel. I've carried that guilt for years. I studied my brother's face so like Dad's in structure, but with Mom's softer eyes. He looked genuinely remorseful, but also relieved to finally speak these truths aloud. I heard about Captain Green, he said after a moment. Dad called me yesterday, told me everything. About Mom's letters, her time in Vietnam. He shook his head in wonder. All those years and we never knew. She tried to protect us, I said. From the war stories. From Dad's disapproval. She was always protecting someone, including you, Jason pointed out. She knew how Dad treated you, but she stayed with him anyway. I bristled slightly. Don't judge her for that. Their relationship was complicated. I'm not judging, he clarified quickly. I'm just trying to understand why she didn't stand up to him more, why she let him diminish you. The question had haunted me too, especially in Mom's final months when Dad's resentment of my presence had become increasingly obvious. Why hadn't she defended me more strongly? Why had she accepted his criticism of me as just another fact of life, like the weather or the price of groceries? I think she did what she could, I said finally. Within the marriage she had, the generation she came from. I twisted the gold watch on my wrist. But in the end, she found a way to have the last word. To make sure I knew how she really felt. Jason smiled slightly. The watch. And that amendment to her will, I nodded. She knew Dad would try to ignore her wishes. So she created a backup plan. Captain Green. Smart, Jason acknowledged. Mom was always smarter than we gave her credit for. We sat in silence for a moment, the cafe noises washing over us, the hiss of the espresso machine, the clink of spoons against ceramic, the murmur of Sunday conversations. I want to make things right, Jason said suddenly, between us. I know I can't undo abandoning you with Mom's care, or standing by at the funeral, but going forward, I want to be a better brother. I'd heard promises from Jason before, promises to visit more often, to call regularly, to be there if I needed him. They had dissolved like sugar in hot tea, sweet intentions with no substance behind them. What does that look like? I asked. Being a better brother? He seemed surprised by the question. I don't know exactly. Being more present, I guess? More supportive. From Seattle, I clarified. While I'm still here in Ashwood. Jason had the grace to look embarrassed. I could visit more often, or... He hesitated. Have you thought about moving? Starting fresh somewhere else? I could help with that, finding you a job in Seattle, helping with the relocation costs. The offer was well-intentioned, I knew. In Jason's mind, fixing my life meant removing me from Ashwood, from the scene of recent trauma, from the small-town existence he'd so eagerly escaped after high school. I'm not looking to leave, I told him. I have a life here. Not the one I planned, maybe, but it's mine. But after everything that's happened, especially after everything that's happened, I interrupted. Running away won't heal anything, Jason. I'm staying. At least for now. He nodded, accepting this with surprising grace. Then I'll visit. For real this time. He pulled out his phone. Let's put actual dates on the calendar. No more vague promises. As we scheduled his next visit Memorial Day weekend, just 6 weeks away, I felt a tentative bridge forming between us. Not forgiveness exactly, but a willingness to try again. To build something new from the wreckage of our family. When we left the cafe, Jason hesitated on the sidewalk. "What about Dad?" he asked. "After what he did at church today?" I thought about Dad's public confession, how it had been both healing and humiliating in its own way. "I don't know yet," I admitted. "That's a longer road." Jason surprised me then, pulling me into an awkward but sincere hug. "You're stronger than both of us," he whispered. "You always have been." As I watched him walk toward his rental car, I realized that Mom had known this all along. Had seen the strength in me that Dad dismissed as weakness, that Jason envied from a distance. She'd known, and in her final act, had made sure I would know it too. I touched the gold watch on my wrist, feeling its steady pulse against my skin. "Time reveals all truths," the inscription said. Perhaps it was finally revealing the truth about me. A month after my mother's funeral, I started a grief support group at the Ashwood Community Center. It wasn't my idea initially. Pastor Richards had suggested it during one of his visits to check on me. But once the seed was planted, it took root quickly. "There's nothing like this in Ashwood," he'd pointed out. "People are left to process loss alone, especially those caring for loved ones before death." "You have valuable experience to share, Rachel." I'd hesitated, unsure if I had healed enough myself to guide others. But the more I thought about those long months of caregiving, the isolation, the exhaustion, the complicated emotions, the more I recognized how much I would have benefited from talking with others who understood. So on a rainy Tuesday evening in May, I arranged folding chairs in a circle and waited nervously to see if anyone would come. They did. 6 people that first night, 3 women who had lost parents, a man whose wife was battling cancer, a teenage girl whose brother had died in a car accident, and to my surprise, Mrs. Peterson, who admitted she still struggled with her husband's death 5 years earlier. "I'm not an expert," I told them as we began. "I'm just someone who's walking this path too. But I think there's power in walking it together." We met weekly after that. Some nights were cathartic, filled with tears and raw confessions. Others were surprisingly joyful, with shared memories and even laughter. Word spread, and our circle gradually expanded to include others bearing the invisible weight of grief. Dad never attended, though I'd extended the invitation through Pastor Richards. But he was making efforts in other ways, small, tentative gestures toward reconciliation, a handwritten card on what would have been Mom's birthday, a text message asking if I needed help when a spring storm knocked out power across town, a box of Mom's favorite books delivered to my apartment with a simple note. "She would want you to have these." I accepted these offerings with cautious gratitude, neither rushing to forgive nor refusing the olive branches he extended. There was no guidebook for rebuilding a relationship fractured by decades of disapproval and one explosive public humiliation. We were finding our way blindly, step by uncertain step. Jason, true to his word, returned for Memorial Day weekend. He arrived with an expensive bottle of wine and awkward determination to reconnect. We spent a day going through Mom's belongings that Dad had finally cleared from the master bedroom, sorting photographs, sharing memories, discovering small treasures we'd forgotten existed. "Look at this," Jason said, pulling a small journal from a box of papers. "Did you know Mom kept a diary?" My heart quickened. "No," I admitted, reaching for it. "She never mentioned it." The journal was slim, its leather cover cracked with age, its pages yellowed. Inside, Mom's familiar handwriting filled entry after entry, beginning in 1971, her time in Vietnam, and continuing through her return home, her early courtship with Dad, and the first years of their marriage. "Should we be reading this?" Jason asked, looking uncertain. I hesitated, then nodded. "I think she would want us to understand, especially now." We took turns reading entries aloud, discovering a young Margaret we'd never known, brave, outspoken, sometimes frightened, often determined. She wrote of the horrors she witnessed in the field hospital, the friendships she formed, the patients she couldn't save. And she wrote of Eli Green, the wounded soldier who became her confidant. May 17th, 1971. Eli was transferred to our unit today. Severe leg trauma, infection setting in. The doctors aren't optimistic, but there's something in his eyes, a fight that won't give up. I've been assigned to his care. I won't give up either. June 3rd, 1971. Eli's fever broke last night. When he opened his eyes this morning, he actually smiled. Called me his guardian angel. I told him angels don't swear as much as I do when changing IV lines. He laughed, then winced because it hurt. But that laugh, it felt like a victory against all this death. August 20th, 1971. Eli's being sent home next week. His leg will never be the same, but he'll walk again, the doctors say. He asked for my address, wants to write. I shouldn't. Nurses aren't supposed to maintain contact with patients, but I gave it to him anyway. Some connections feel too important to break. The entries continued after her return to the States, chronicling her readjustment to civilian life, her struggle to find purpose after the intensity of war. She wrote of meeting Dad at a friend's wedding, of his steady presence and traditional values that seemed to offer the stability she craved. November 12th, 1972. Douglas proposed tonight. He's everything I should want, kind, stable, rooted in his community. He knows nothing of Vietnam, wants nothing to do with my stories from there. Perhaps that's for the best. A clean slate, a normal life. Isn't that what I fought for others to have? December 1st, 1972. Received another letter from Eli. He's starting college on the GI Bill, studying psychology. Says he wants to help other veterans. I haven't told Douglas about these letters. They feel like they belong to a different Margaret, one Douglas never knew. One I'm not sure exists anymore. Jason and I exchanged glances as the entries grew shorter and less frequent after Mom's marriage. The vibrant voice of the young nurse gradually faded, replaced by brief notes about household matters, pregnancy symptoms, childcare challenges. She changed, Jason said quietly. For him. For us. I nodded, a lump forming in my throat. She became the Margaret Monroe everyone in Ashwood knew. PTA president, Sunday school teacher, the perfect postal worker's wife. But even as her entries grew sparse, her correspondence with Captain Green continued. She mentioned his letters occasionally, always with a sense of guilty secrecy. July 18th, 1982. Letter from Eli today. He's finished his PhD, working at a VA hospital in Pittsburgh. I hide his letters in my sewing basket now. Douglas would never look there. Sometimes I wonder what my life would have been if I'd made different choices. If I'd been brave enough to keep being the Margaret from Vietnam instead of this safer version I've become. The final entry was dated just weeks before Jason's birth, April 3rd, 1984. The baby could come any day now. Douglas is certain it's another boy. I dream it's a girl, someone who might understand parts of me the men in my life never could. I'll name her Rachel after my grandmother. And someday, when she's old enough, maybe I'll tell her about Vietnam, about the person I used to be, about courage that looks like survival, not heroics. I closed the journal gently, tears streaming down my face. She wanted to tell me, I whispered. All those years she wanted to share that part of herself. Why didn't she? Jason asked. I thought of Dad's rigid views, his discomfort with anything that challenged his orderly vision of the world. I thought of Mom's gradual surrender of her own narrative, her retreat into the role expected of her. I think she was afraid, I said, of disappointing Dad, of disrupting the family, of not being the mother we thought she was. Or maybe, Jason suggested, she was protecting that part of herself, keeping it sacred by sharing it only with someone who already understood. Captain Green, I murmured. Jason nodded. Their friendship, it wasn't a betrayal of Dad. It was her way of staying whole. We sat in silence, surrounded by the artifacts of our mother's life photographs, books, trinkets collected over decades. But it was the journal that felt most precious now. This glimpse into the woman behind the mother we thought we knew completely. I want to be more like her, I said suddenly. Not the part that hid herself away, but the part that was brave enough to keep that connection alive. To honor all sides of who she was, even the ones that didn't fit neatly into her life. Jason squeezed my hand. You already are, Rachel. Coming back to Ashwood, caring for Mom, standing up to Dad in your own quiet way, that took the same kind of courage she showed in Vietnam. That night, after Jason returned to his hotel, I sat alone in my apartment and reread Mom's journal from the beginning. When I reached the final entry, her hopes for the daughter she was carrying, I made a decision. I would contact Captain Green again. I would learn more about the Margaret who served in Vietnam, who saved lives, who formed connections strong enough to last decades. I would reclaim that part of her story not just for myself, but for her, so that the full truth of who she was would not be lost. And perhaps in understanding her more completely, I might understand myself as well. Captain Eli Green arrived in Ashwood on a perfect June morning, the kind my mother would have spent in her garden, nurturing roses and pulling weeds with careful hands. I met him at Ashwood's only bed and breakfast, a Victorian house on Maple Street run by the Hendersons since before I was born. Ms. Monroe, he greeted me, rising from his seat on the front porch. Thank you for inviting me back. Rachel, please, I insisted, noting how much more at ease he seemed than during our first meeting. And thank you for coming. I know it's a long drive from Pittsburgh. He smiled, the lines around his eyes deepening. For Margaret's daughter, I'd drive twice as far. We walked to Carson's Cafe, the morning sun warming our shoulders. Captain Green Eli, as he'd asked me to call him, moved with a slight limp, the lasting reminder of his Vietnam injury. Yet he maintained the straight-backed posture of a military man, his steps deliberate and measured. I've been reading Mom's journal, I told him as we settled at a corner table. The one she kept during Vietnam and the early years of her marriage. Eli's eyes widened slightly. I didn't know she kept a journal. None of us did, I said. Jason and I found it last month going through her things. I hesitated. She wrote about you, about how you met, your recovery, the letters you exchanged over the years. He nodded, a mixture of emotions playing across his weathered face. Those letters were a lifeline for me, he admitted, a connection to someone who saw me at my worst and still believed I had something to offer the world. She felt the same way about your friendship, I said. In her journal, she called your letters her window to a wider world after she settled in Ashwood. Our coffee arrived, and we fell into easy conversation. Eli shared stories of my mother as a young nurse, her efficiency during trauma cases, her irreverent humor that kept spirits up during the darkest days, her unwavering compassion for the wounded soldiers in her care. She had this way of making you feel like you were the only patient that mattered, he recalled, stirring his coffee absently. Even surrounded by chaos, understaffed and overwhelmed, she'd look you in the eye and say, "We're going to get through this together." And you believed her? I smiled, recognizing the mother I knew in his description. She was like that with everyone, I said. Even at the end, when she was the patient, she'd ask the nurses about their families, remember their children's names. That was Margaret, Eli agreed, always turning the spotlight away from herself. I hesitated, then asked the question that had been nagging at me since discovering Mom's journal. Were you in love with her? Eli didn't seem surprised by the directness of my question. He set down his coffee cup and met my eyes. Yes, he said simply. For a time. How could I not be? She saved my life, saw value in me when I'd given up. And she? I pressed gently. She cared deeply for me, he said carefully. But Margaret was committed to the life she chose to your father, to you and Jason. She never wavered in that commitment. Even when she was unhappy? The words slipped out before I could stop them. Eli studied me for a long moment. Your mother found joy in her life, Rachel, in her children especially. Was she fulfilled in every way? Perhaps not. Few of us are. He leaned forward slightly. But she made her choices with open eyes. That's all any of us can do. I twisted Mom's gold watch on my wrist, thinking of the inscription. Time reveals all truths. I've been angry with her, I confessed. For not standing up to Dad more, for letting him treat me the way he did, for staying in a marriage that seemed to diminish her. That's a natural reaction, Eli said gently. But remember, we're viewing her life through the lens of a different generation, different expectations. The Margaret I knew in Vietnam was fierce and independent, yes. But she also valued stability, commitment, family above all. Above her own happiness? She redefined happiness, Eli suggested. Found it in different places than she might have originally imagined. In you, especially. We spent the morning talking, wandering from the cafe to the small park by the river where Mom used to take me as a child. Eli was a natural storyteller, painting vivid pictures of a time and place I'd never known, but that had shaped the woman who raised me. As noon approached, I checked my watch. "We should head to the community center," I said. "Everyone will be arriving soon." Eli nodded, a hint of nervousness crossing his face. "Are you sure about this, Rachel? It's not too late to change your mind." "I'm sure," I said firmly. "It's time for the whole truth to be heard." The idea had come to me after rereading Mom's journal. A special session of the grief support group, expanded to include anyone in Ashwood who had known my mother. An opportunity to share memories, to celebrate her life more fully than the funeral had allowed. And a chance to introduce the town to the Margaret Monroe most of them had never known, the young nurse who had served in Vietnam, who had saved lives and witnessed horrors, who had carried those experiences silently while baking cookies for school fundraisers and teaching Sunday school. Pastor Richards had embraced the idea enthusiastically, helping to spread the word and secure the larger meeting room at the community center. I'd invited everyone: Dad, Jason, Mom's friends from church, her fellow volunteers from the library, even her doctors and nurses from the hospital. And of course, Captain Eli Green, the keeper of her wartime memories. "I'm not sure what to expect," I admitted to Eli as we approached the center. "Small towns can be set in their views. Mom was, well, she was an institution here. The perfect wife, mother, volunteer. The perfect postal worker's wife," Eli said with a slight smile, quoting from Mom's journal. "Exactly. I don't know how people will react to learning there was so much more to her." Eli squeezed my hand reassuringly. "Your mother touched many lives, Rachel. In many different ways. Trust that those who truly loved her will welcome knowing her more completely." Inside, the meeting room was already filling with familiar faces. Mrs. Peterson waved from a seat near the front, beside her friend Judith from the garden club. Pastor Richard stood chatting with Dr. Weston, who had overseen Mom's care in her final months. Jason had flown in from Seattle the night before and was helping arrange additional chairs as more people arrived. And there, sitting quietly in a corner, was my father. I hadn't been sure he would come. Our relationship remained fragile, improving through small, careful interactions, but nowhere near healed. He'd listened when I told him about finding Mom's journal, about inviting Eli back to Ashwood, about organizing this memorial gathering. He hadn't objected, but he hadn't offered enthusiasm either. Yet here he was, dressed in a pressed shirt and tie, looking both out of place and determined to stay. When our eyes met, he nodded slightly, a gesture of, support? Resignation? Perhaps a bit of both. As the room filled to capacity, nearly 50 people crowding into a space designed for 30, I felt a surge of gratitude. Whatever else she might have kept private, Mom had clearly been loved by many. Pastor Richards called the gathering to order with a brief prayer, then turned to me. "Rachel has organized this special memorial for her mother, Margaret Monroe. I'll let her explain." I stepped to the front of the room, suddenly nervous despite having rehearsed my words for days. The gold watch felt heavy on my wrist, a tangible connection to the woman we had gathered to remember. "Thank you all for coming," I began. "As many of you know, I started a grief support group here after Mom died. It's helped me understand that healing comes not just from mourning what we've lost, but from truly knowing what we had." I took a deep breath. I thought I knew my mother completely. I was wrong. A murmur rippled through the room. Last month, my brother Jason and I discovered Mom's journal from 1971, when she served as a nurse in Vietnam, an experience she rarely spoke about. I held up the small leather book. Through her words and through the generosity of someone who knew her then, I've discovered a Margaret Monroe many of us never met, brave, outspoken, fiercely dedicated to saving lives in the most difficult circumstances imaginable. I gestured to Eli, who stood at my silent invitation. "This is Captain Elijah Green. Mom cared for him after he was wounded in Vietnam, and they maintained a friendship through letters for over 40 years. He's here today to help us understand a chapter of Mom's life that shaped everything that came after." For the next hour, Eli and I took turns reading selected entries from Mom's journal, sharing stories, piecing together the full picture of Margaret Monroe, nurse. Wife, mother, friend, secret correspondent. We spoke of her courage in Vietnam, her struggle to readjust to civilian life, her choice to channel her caregiving skills into motherhood and community service. Throughout, I watched the faces of those gathered. Surprise, admiration, occasionally tears. Mrs. Peterson nodded vigorously at descriptions of Mom's fierce advocacy for wounded soldiers, as if recognizing the same determination she'd shown when fighting. For new books for the library, Dr. Weston smiled sadly at Mom's reflections on maintaining hope in seemingly hopeless medical situations. And my father, his expression was the most complex of all. Pain, pride, regret, understanding all passing over his face like clouds across the sun. When Eli shared stories of Mom's humor and resilience under fire, Dad actually smiled, as if recognizing the woman he'd fallen in love with before decades of routine had obscured her spark. As our presentation drew to a close, I held up the gold watch. Many of you witnessed what happened at Mom's funeral, I said, my voice steady despite the difficult memory. This watch, passed down through generations of women in Mom's family, became a symbol of conflict in our family. But Mom intended it as something else, a connection to her authentic self, to the strength she sometimes had to hide, but never lost. I looked directly at my father, whose eyes were fixed on the watch. The inscription reads, "Time reveals all truths." Today, I hope we've honored that sentiment by sharing the full truth of who Margaret Monroe was, not just the roles she played in our lives, but the complete, complex, remarkable woman behind those roles. As I finished speaking, the room fell silent. Then, slowly, people began to share their own memories of Mom's small moments that now took on new meaning in light of what they'd learned. The time she calmed a panicking child trapped in an overturned car after an accident, working with methodical focus until emergency services arrived. The way she organized the town's response when the river flooded in '98, creating an efficient system for distributing supplies that the mayor himself praised. Her quiet insistence on establishing a college scholarship fund for Ashwood's high school students, particularly those interested in healthcare. She never talked about Vietnam, Mrs. Peterson said wonderingly, but now I can see how it informed everything she did here. She was the same person, Eli offered, just different facets of the same remarkable woman. As the sharing continued, I noticed my father rise from his seat and slip out of the room. A knot formed in my stomach. Had this been too much for him? Had exposing Mom's private thoughts, her complex feelings about their marriage, been a step too far in our fragile reconciliation? I excused myself and followed him into the hallway, finding him standing by a window that overlooked the community garden Mom had helped establish. "Dad?" I approached cautiously. "Are you okay?" He didn't turn from the window. "I didn't know her," he said softly. "Not really. All those years together and I never truly saw her." I stood beside him, unsure what to say. "That's not your fault," he continued, finally looking at me. "It's mine. I didn't want to know about Vietnam, about the nightmares she had those first few years, about the person she'd been before me. I wanted the Margaret who fit into my life, my plans." He shook his head. "I was a fool. You loved her," I offered. "I did," he agreed. "But love should see clearly, Rachel. I looked at your mother and saw what I wanted to see. Just as I looked at you and saw only what didn't match my expectations." His voice broke slightly. "I missed so much. I thought of all the times I'd felt invisible in my father's presence, measured against an impossible standard and found wanting. Of Mom's quiet attempts to bridge the gap between us, never entirely successful. Of the journal entries where she expressed regret for not standing up to him more forcefully on my behalf. We can't change the past, I said finally. But we're here now, trying to see each other more clearly. That counts for something. Dad nodded, his eyes moving to Mom's watch on my wrist. She wanted you to have that. She was right, he hesitated. Your mother was right about many things, including you, Rachel. She saw your strength long before I did. It wasn't a full apology or a complete transformation. But in my father's acknowledgement, I felt a willingness to question his own certainties, to reconsider fixed judgments. It was more than I had expected, and for now, enough to build upon. Would you like to come back in? I asked. People are sharing their memories of Mom. He considered for a moment, then nodded. I'd like that. And perhaps I have a few memories to share as well, of the Margaret I did know. Together, we returned to the room where Mom's life was being celebrated in all its complexity. The young nurse, the loyal friend, the devoted mother, the quiet force for good in a small town. The woman strong enough to live truthfully through her letters when circumstances required a more conventional facade. The keeper of secrets who, in the end, had ensured the truth would be revealed. Time reveals all truths, the watch said. And in that crowded room, surrounded by those who had loved her in different ways, Margaret Monroe's truth was finally, fully honored. Autumn came to Ashwood in a blaze of red and gold, transforming the maple-lined streets into tunnels of flame. A year had passed since Mom's diagnosis, 6 months since her death, and the sharp edges of grief had begun to soften, like sea glass worn smooth by persistent waves. The grief support group continued to meet, though my role had shifted from seeking comfort to offering it. Pastor Richards joked that I'd found my calling, but there was truth beneath his teasing. In guiding others through loss, I discovered a purpose that felt meaningful in ways my previous teaching career never had. On a crisp October morning, I sat at my kitchen table reviewing notes for that evening's session. My tiny apartment had gradually transformed over the months. Mom's books lined newly installed shelves, her quilts draped across my secondhand furniture, her photographs arranged beside my own. Not a shrine to the past, but a bridge between what was and what could be. A knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. I opened it to find Mrs. Peterson clutching a manila envelope and looking uncharacteristically nervous. "Good morning, Rachel," she said. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." Not at all. I stepped back, inviting her in. "Coffee?" She declined, perching on the edge of my love seat. "I've been debating whether to give you this," she said, turning the envelope in her hands. "Your mother left it with me about a month before she passed. Said I should wait until the time was right." My pulse quickened. "What is it?" Mrs. Peterson shook her head. "I don't know." She sealed it before giving it to me. "But yesterday when I saw you wearing her watch at the library looking so much like her," she extended the envelope. It felt right. I accepted it with trembling hands, noting Mom's handwriting across the front. "For Rachel when you're ready." "Thank you for keeping this safe," I told Mrs. Peterson. After she left, I sat for several minutes staring at the envelope, gathering courage. Finally, I broke the seal. Inside were several items: a smaller envelope addressed to Captain Green, a typed letter from a law firm in Portland where I'd been teaching before Mom's illness, and a handwritten note on Mom's favorite stationery. I read the note first. "My dearest Rachel, if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you've begun to find your way forward. I've asked Harriet Peterson to hold this until she sees that light returning to your eyes, the spark that tells her you're ready for new beginnings. Enclosed, you'll find a letter to Eli. Please send it to him. It contains things I want him to know but couldn't express in person. There's also a letter from Malcolm Stevens, an attorney in Portland. He's been holding something for you at my request. Rachel, coming home to care for me was the most selfless act of love I've ever received. But I never intended it to derail your life permanently. The path you choose now, whether staying in Ashwood or returning to Portland or venturing somewhere entirely new, should be your choice, made freely and with options before you. Remember what I told you as a child when you were afraid to try new things? Courage isn't about not being scared, Rachel. It's about being scared and doing it anyway. I lived by those words in Vietnam. I hope you'll live by them now. The watch on your wrist isn't just a family heirloom. It's a reminder that our time here is finite and precious. Use yours wisely, my brave girl. Choose joy. Choose authenticity. Choose a life that honors all of who you are. With endless love, Mom tears blurred my vision as I set aside the note and opened the letter from the Portland attorney. It was brief and formal, explaining that Margaret Monroe had established a trust in my name containing $75,000, the proceeds from the sale of her mother's house in Vermont, which she'd inherited years ago but never mentioned. Mrs. Monroe stipulated that these funds be disclosed to you only after her passing, the letter explained, and specified they were to be used for education, entrepreneurship, or whatever dreams my daughter has deferred. I sat back, stunned. Mom had never hinted at this inheritance, this secret provision for my future. Even as she'd accepted my care during her illness, she'd been planning for my life after her death. The third item, the sealed letter for Captain Green, I set aside. Whatever final words Mom had for her longtime friend were private. not meant for my eyes. That evening, after the support group meeting, I drove to the cemetery. The October sunset painted the sky in the same fiery colors as the trees, casting long shadows across the gravestones. Mom's was still new, the marble not yet weathered by seasons of snow and rain. I sat beside it, running my fingers over her name carved in the cool stone. Margaret Eleanor Monroe, beloved wife and mother, 1949-2023. You had a plan all along, didn't you? I said softly. Even when you were dying, you were thinking ahead for me. The evening breeze rustled the nearby maple trees, sending a shower of crimson leaves spiraling to the ground. I imagined Mom's voice in the gentle sound, encouraging as always. I've been offered my old teaching position back, I told her. Portland Elementary called last week. They have an opening for January. I twisted the gold watch on my wrist. I haven't given them an answer yet. The truth was, I felt pulled in multiple directions. Portland represented my independent life, the career I'd built before Mom's illness. But Ashwood had become more than just my hometown. It was where I'd discovered my strength, where the grief support group had flourished under my guidance, where I'd begun to reconcile with Dad and rebuild a relationship with Jason. The money changes things, I admitted. I could stay here, maybe start something new. The community center director mentioned they need someone to expand their senior programs. Or I could go back to Portland, possibly buy a small place instead of renting. I paused, watching the sunset deepen to purple at the edges. Or maybe something completely different. Remember how I always talked about getting a master's degree? I could do that now. In the months since Mom's death, I'd been existing rather than planning, focusing on each day rather than imagining a future. The trust fund didn't solve everything. It wasn't enough to live on indefinitely, but it offered breathing room. Options, the luxury of choice. Captain Green invited me to visit him in Pittsburgh, I continued. He wants to show me the VA hospital where he works, introduce me to some of the veterans' programs. Says they're always looking for people with a background in education and counseling. The idea had been percolating since our last conversation, when Eli had described the art therapy program he'd helped establish for veterans with PTSD. You have a gift for holding space for people's pain, he'd told me. We need that in the work we do. As darkness settled over the cemetery, I stood and brushed the grass from my jeans. I don't have all the answers yet, I told Mom's grave. But I'm not afraid to look for them anymore. I touched the watch one last time, the connection between past and future, between the woman who had raised me and the woman I was becoming. 2 weeks later, I stood on the porch of the house I'd grown up in, waiting for Dad to answer the doorbell. We'd established a careful routine of Sunday dinners, sometimes just the two of us, occasionally with Jason joining by video call from Seattle. Today's conversation would disrupt that pattern. Dad opened the door, surprise flickering across his face. Rachel, I wasn't expecting you until Sunday. I know, I said. Can I come in? There's something I need to tell you. He led me to the living room where so much of Mom's final year had been spent. The hospital bed was long gone, along with the medical equipment that had transformed our family space into a sick room. Dad had redecorated subtly new curtains, a different arrangement of furniture making the room his own while keeping touches of Mom throughout. Is everything all right? He asked as we sat across from each other, concern etching his face. Everything's fine, I assured him. But I've made a decision. I'm moving to Pittsburgh after the holidays. Dad's eyebrows rose. Pittsburgh? Why Pittsburgh? I explained about Captain Green's invitation, the veterans programs, the opportunity to combine my teaching background with the counseling skills I'd developed through the grief support group. It feels right, I concluded. A way to honor Mom's memory while building something new for myself. Dad was quiet for a long moment, his hands clasped tightly in his lap. Then he nodded slowly. Your mother would be proud, he said. You're carrying forward her work in your own way. The acknowledgement free from criticism or judgment felt like a gift. 6 months ago, he might have called my decision impulsive or questioned my qualifications. Today, he simply accepted that my path was mine to choose. I'll come back to visit, I promised. And you're welcome in Pittsburgh anytime. I'd like that, he said, and I believed him. This house will always be here for you, Rachel. Whenever you need it. As I prepared to leave, Dad disappeared briefly into his study, returning with a small box. I found this last week, going through some old files, he said, handing it to me. I think you should have it. Inside was a faded photograph I'd never seen before. Mom in her nurse's uniform, standing beside a military helicopter, her hair blowing in the rotor wash. Her expression a mixture of determination and fear. She sent it to me when we first started writing to each other, Dad explained. Before she came home, before we were engaged. I'd forgotten I had it. I studied the image of my mother so young, so brave, facing circumstances I could hardly imagine. Thank you, I said softly. This means a lot. Dad nodded, his eyes on the photograph. She was extraordinary, he said. And so are you, Rachel. In your own way. He hesitated. I'm sorry it took me so long to see that. I hugged him then, not our usual awkward embrace, but something warmer, more genuine. Not forgiveness exactly, but acceptance. Of his limitations, of my strength, of the imperfect love between us. On a snowy morning in January, I packed the last boxes into my car. The apartment above Bloom and Petal looked bare without my belongings, though I'd left some furniture for the next tenant, the new grief support group facilitator I'd trained over the past 2 months, Mrs. Peterson, had organized a goodbye gathering at the community center the night before, where I'd been overwhelmed by the turnout. People I'd helped through grief, neighbors who'd known me since childhood, even Jason, who'd flown in from Seattle to drive back with me to Pittsburgh, helping me settle before catching a flight home. Ready? He asked now, sliding into the passenger seat as I took one last look at the building that had sheltered me through the most difficult year of my life. Ready, I confirmed, starting the engine. As we drove through Ashwood past the church where Mom's funeral had been held, past the library where she'd volunteered, past the high school where I'd once taught, I felt not sadness but a sense of completion. This chapter was ending, but the story continued. Mom's gold watch gleamed on my wrist, catching the winter sunlight. Time reveals all truths, the truth of my mother nurse, survivor, secret keeper, strength disguised as softness. The truth of my father flawed, evolving, capable of change even after decades of rigidity. The truth of myself not a failure for returning home, not defined by others' expectations, stronger than I'd ever realized. You know, Jason said as we passed the town limits sign, Mom would love this. You following your own path, using what you learned from her loss to help others. I smiled, thinking of the letter I'd sent to Captain Green, Mom's final words to her longtime friend. He'd called me after receiving it, his voice thick with emotion. Your mother thanked me for being her witness all those years, he'd said. For seeing the Margaret that others didn't know existed. She asked me to be your witness now, Rachel. To see your journey forward and remind you of your mother's courage when you need that reminder. As Ashwood disappeared in the rearview mirror, I felt Mom's presence not behind but beside me, the strength she'd passed down more valuable than any watch or trust fund. The inheritance that mattered most was the courage to live authentically, to find purpose in pain, to begin again. She would love this, I agreed. As the highway opened before us, leading toward Pittsburgh, toward a future I could finally imagine with hope instead of fear. And so do I.